patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 130 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. As always, I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me for this interview episode, our first one really delving into environmental issues and policy. Before we get started, as always, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens if you are enjoying this show. Also, be sure to check out our Patreon as well. Once again, a big shout out to our Patreon supporters as always. If you donate $10 or more for our Patreon membership, you will get a complimentary Friends and Fellow Citizens mug. And I guarantee you that these mugs are fantastic, made in the USA, handmade, and just an absolutely great deal here. So be sure to check out our Patreon to support our program. We always really appreciate all of the support, and I know that our Patreon supporters are there for us. And as always, I thank them very much for their help. Today's episode is featuring Stephen Perkins. Stephen Perkins is a conservative strategist and activist who develops movements and the leaders that advance them. As the American Conservation Coalition's Vice President of Grassroots Strategy, he oversees the organization's grassroots programming, strategy, and growth. In this role, he empowers the field team, staff, and local activists to grow as leaders in the conservative environmental movement. Stephen also oversees the annual ACC Summit, which brings together 300 students and young professionals for a weekend of education, training, and motivation. Prior to joining ACC, Stephen helped more than 50 local, statewide, and federal campaigns and advocacy organizations grow their online communities over 3 campaign cycles. Other previous work includes marketing, consulting, advocacy training, and leadership coaching to national, political, and educational organizations. His work and writings have been featured in numerous publications, including The Hill, Real Clear Energy, Washington Examiner, and the Dallas Morning News. Stephen earned a BA in political science from the University of Texas at Arlington, where he studied political leadership and civic engagement. Originally from Houston, he currently resides in Fort Worth, Texas, with his dog, Hudson. He is a passionate traveler and enjoys exploring America's natural beauty through camping and hiking. All right, everyone. Well, I am very excited to have Stephen Perkins on to Friends and Fellow Citizens. Stephen, thank you so much for taking some time today to be on the program.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, first of all, a big shout out to your colleague, Carly Matthews, for putting this together, for recommending you, and for coordinating this interview. So I really appreciate her efforts too. Let's get right into a bit about yourself. So tell us a little bit about how you got to the position you are at the American Conservation Coalition, and just some of the interests that have led you to pursuing the kinds of policy advocacy and activism that you're pursuing right now.
Yeah, I think thinking about my career path, it's been certainly very odd. I can't really put rhyme or reason to it. But, going back to 13 years old is when I got involved in politics for the first time, volunteered for some campaigns, and then also developed an interest in business kind of at the same time as well. I was a real nerdy kid in that respect, I guess. Politics and business were the two things. As I originally thought that I wanted to be in political media and do journalism and commentary. And as I got more and more involved throughout high school and college in the conservative movement, I just started to see, even back then, I started to see a really challenging path that the conservative movement was on. And that's when toward the end of college, I switched over to be more political science and some of the marketing behind that. That was one of my first jobs, was to do marketing for political campaigns. You see it even more when you're working with campaign teams and kind of the discussions that go on behind the scenes. I have just seen our movement handle really pressing and really challenging issues in a very unproductive way. And that worries me about the future of conservatism, but also just American politics in general, because I believe that you need both sides, and you need a healthy system of actors on both sides. And so, I think my career really changed toward helping build the movement into what it needs to be, and also help develop the leaders that are part of that. ACC was something that was started by Benji Backer, someone who had been a friend of mine at that point for quite a few years. We met through CPAC and through Twitter, when Twitter was, the ultimate networking site. And I think he identified this need for conservatives to be more engaged, better engaged on climate conservation and environmental issues. And when he brought up the idea to me and some other people, it just made sense. And so, started out as a volunteer there and helped where I could along the founding. And then a couple of years ago, they had this need to really grow out our grassroots department and really start to grow branches and membership around the country. And so I was lucky enough to be able to join full time. It was sort of a full circle moment, coming back full time to an organization that I was with from the beginning. But I never would have thought that I would do environmental work or work for a climate nonprofit. But it sucks you in. It's a supportive community. It's an exciting one, especially when you're at the nexus of climate policy and the conservative movement. So it's been fun to work on.
Well, it's amazing that you've got into this space and recognizing that we do have a problem in the conservative movement of just addressing these issues. It seems like when you go on any mainstream news site or just in public discourse, environmental concern is always associated with the left wing. And yet I feel like it's so much broader, because who really is against having a clean environment? It's just kind of a strange thing for people to just associate these kinds of larger principles with one wing of the political spectrum. Now, let's get a bit more into the ACC, kind of how it's developed and what sort of things it does. So, Stephen, can you walk us through the mission and values of the ACC and what it aims to do, especially with what you said about moving on from this unproductiveness from the conservative movement and finding more of these common ground solutions there?
Yeah, so our missions kind of evolved throughout the years. At first, our kind of big mission was to change the narrative of the environmental movement, and that was because we were trying to bring Republicans and conservatives to the table in these discussions. I'm happy to say that we've now done that for in big part. The Conservative Climate Caucus in the House is one of the largest Republican caucuses in the House of Representatives, in the House of Reps. We've seen Republican and conservative leadership on this. So now our mission is to build the conservative movement. And a lot of people wonder, because we have people in our organization who consider themselves apolitical, center left. And a lot of people wonder, how are you building the conservative movement, but you have people who are not conservative? And what I say is that if you think of sort of that window or that range, you're right that environmentalism has been, for the past 2-3 decades, in the center left and at times on the far left. We're trying to build the conservative side to counterbalance that and to bring it more toward the middle. So really, our vision, our vision is for a cleaner, more prosperous world where collaboration helps drive environmental conservation. And so I like that, because you can see it. It is a world where this issue becomes as bipartisan as naming a new post office or naming a highway after a fallen hero. That is really what we're driving toward, because just the fact is that liberal policy is not going to solve this issue. Conservative policy is not going to serve this issue, but they can work together and come together and create bipartisan policy that is durable, which means it'll last for more than one administration, and that also brings in everybody. I'm from Texas. I care a lot about our rural communities here in Texas, a lot of oil and gas communities. I want them to be just as empowered in the environmental movement as a coastal big, city like New York or DC or Los Angeles. Everyone should be able to be a winner when it comes to our cleaner, more prosperous future.
You're absolutely right. And I think connecting the different elements or different parts of the country into this movement, I think is so critical too, because we always kind of forget that we're a lot more interconnected than we like to think. Can you tell us a little bit about your role with regards to ACC? Because I'm very interested in how you've certainly taken all these issues and you're piecing these together. What's your role in this ACC movement?
Yeah, so it's a fun time. For the past 2 years, I've been our vice president of grassroots strategy. Come August, I'm moving to our chief operating officer role. But really, the focus is the same, which is making sure that our branches and our members from across the country have the resources they need to be active in their communities and to advocate for the policies that we care about. And so the question has always been, why build members and branches, and why do you need a grassroots component when you could just go to DC and advocate for climate policy? Because we certainly do that, but we need something to point back to. And what we're able to do now when we go into a member of Congress's office is we're able to say, this isn't just something that our organization wants. We have tens of thousands of young people, mostly conservative, who want to vote for you in the next election. But climate, according to some polls, is the number 2 issue for even young conservative voters. We're able to point to those people and say they're active in their communities. They know about policy. They know about you, and they know if you're going to be doing good work or bad work on this. And so that's why it's been so important to grow the grassroots side. And my role has really been one of expanding our membership. We've grown significantly over the past couple of years, along with the number of branches we have, and also just making sure that there's countless stories of people who joined us because they liked a sticker of ours. And now today they are one of our most vocal activists. And in meetings with members of Congress, I love that progression of people who say, a lot of people even who say, I'm not very political, but I understand the importance of the political end of it. I understand the importance of advocating for what I believe. And so, I may not know everything about it, but I'm going to try and do my best. So we have a bunch of great advocates across the country who I get to support.
That's awesome. And free stickers or just stickers in general certainly go a long way, So that's awesome to hear about how people are expressing their concern about the environment to you and doing so in a nonpartisan way. I think is phenomenal. So let's just go straight into some of these policy areas. Now, you kind of touched upon a little bit about the DC side of things. But there's a lot of things we'll kind of get through some of the policies and then move on to really some of the challenges of even just trying to get the message out and not trying to get your message through. There are a lot of, you mentioned, there's really a lot of far left stuff and a lot of alarmism that's kind of running around here nowadays. But let's go to the policy. So what sort of key issues or areas of focus do you think the nation as a whole should be really looking towards to achieve that broader objective of preserving our environment? It's a broad question, I know, but if you can boil down to a few, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, well, in my view, it's a lot of low hanging fruit. It's a lot of stuff that has bipartisan support, but also that we could get done this year and see the effects of it next year. What I always get frustrated by is this idea, the Green New Deal, we don't support it for a number of reasons, but I always say, do we want to spend the next 5-10 years arguing, each congressional session about Green New Deal, or do we actually want to get some stuff done in the meantime that has bipartisan support? So we've created, it's called the Climate Commitment. You can go to theclimatecommitment.com. It's six big ideas or six pillars to solve climate change. But in terms of the actual policy that we're focused on right now, there's really three areas that we think have the biggest opportunity this year that can get done. Number one is permitting reform. A lot of people don't realize that there are so many clean energy projects in this country that are ready to go, but the government stands in the way. The government says, we have to do an environmental review. We have to do all these permits. In some cases, it takes a decade or more for a clean energy project to get the permits that it needs to start construction. That is insane to me. I mean, we are a country that have built engineering marvels in just a couple of years, and to get a new wind farm built, we've got to have a 10-year environmental review. And so that's one of the areas that you're starting to see a lot of bipartisan support on, and we're confident that that's going to get done this Congress. The second area is making sure, it's sort of in a similar vein, but making sure that we can support and streamline the process to build new nuclear power. Nuclear power gets a bad rap, honestly, if I'm being frank, by people who don't know anything about nuclear power. It's often just a feeling. Nuclear is scary. We saw, we don't want Homer Simpson operating our nuclear facilities. But especially advanced nuclear power that we have today is, first of all, emissions free. I think that's huge. It provides baseload power. So one nuclear plant can do the work of hundreds of acres of solar or wind. And so you think about how much more efficient that is. But there are some real big regulatory challenges standing in the way, similar to permitting, and the government needs to get out of its own way so that we can build more nuclear. And then the third one, which is probably one of my favorite and one of our members' favorites, is natural climate solutions, right? Things like planting 1 trillion more trees. Not hard to do, may take a little bit of time, but these are, if we implemented, scientists say that if we implemented natural climate solutions effectively, we could capture about 30% of the emissions that we need to hit our climate goals. 30% just by planting trees, by having more regenerative agriculture, by restoring our shorelines and, having more mangroves on the coast to help with erosion, those sort of things, using nature to fight climate change. So those are the three areas that I think have a lot of opportunity, and you don't have to be a conservative to believe that we should build more nuclear power or believe that clean energy should be easier and quicker to build. Those are bipartisan areas of action.
Very well said. I can see why the last one is your favorite. I think what I like about that third one, of course, all three are important, but the last one seems like there can be so much more potential for community involvement. So you can bring students and senior citizens and middle-aged people and just everyone, right, to plant trees because there's so many. It feels like nowadays in politics, there's so many people are now or things that are now considered controversial. It's like I hope that trees are not controversial ever.
Well, and 99 when you look at it, 90% of people support planting more trees to fight climate change. I'd like to meet the 10% who don't. But I also saw this morning from our friends at Audubon Society. We've had record high temperatures across the country. Here in Texas, it's very hot. We've had people unfortunately dying from it. And you think about our cities, our more urban areas. If we just had more trees planted, it could be a 10% reduction in the temperature. Think of how many lives that would save, but also think of how just more efficiently and more healthy our cities would be. Just planting trees. And you're right, our members on a local level, we go out and plant trees. We haven't planted anywhere near 1 trillion yet, but we're hoping to, even just a few can help with that.
Well, that would be such an amazing feat, right? To do the 1 trillion tree kind of challenge, and what a unifying feeling that would be. I mean, if so, all these countries were to participate in that. And let's go more into some of the challenges of advancing this narrative. I mean, where do you start, right? Like there's so many different complications. One of the areas that I like to ask you about, which is kind of really just the nature of this subject, which is, kind of associated with science, right? With climate science.
And yet most people, obviously, the vast majority of people are not climate scientists, including myself, and it's not to say that you have to be, a lawyer to understand the Constitution. You have to be an economist to understand the economy. But this seems like, because it's more of a natural sciencey sort of element, I wonder how different it can be in terms of how people associate themselves with this policy. And so one of the things I just want to raise is really, how do you kind of cut through the science element, knowing that there is a political element to it. And we've heard over the last few years, first starting with COVID, trust the science and all that. And yet there's clearly a political side to it. How do you kind of separate, or I guess to some degree integrate, the natural science element, the findings element, as well as the political element, without, in a way, kind of messing around with the nature of those two subject areas?
Yeah, well, and the mainstream environmental movement doesn't do itself any favors when it at times manipulates science and manipulates reports that are put out. For example, the United Nations, when they put out their yearly report, the headlines that go across news and environmental organizations are, we have, we have 2 years, or and what they do is that when you read those reports, and unfortunately I've had to read through them, they're not the most captivating things, but science, especially climate science, is about modeling. And being from Houston, I'm familiar, as anyone from the coast is, with like hurricane modeling. And you'll see on the news they'll put up all these models of where this hurricane could go, and you'll have, if it's going toward Houston, you'll have maybe 80% of those paths showing that it's going there. But then you've got one splitting off to Mexico, and one that's going to loop around to Florida, and maybe one that's going to hit Alabama, Mississippi. Those are extreme outlier models that they put out there to show you these are all the possibilities. But unfortunately, what a lot of people in the environmental movement do is they take the extreme projections and the extreme models, and they use it to drum up fear in order to advance their policies. I'm just not interested in doing that. ACC is not interested in doing that. We believe that there's already enough climate anxiety. We don't need to add to that. It's really even ethically wrong to do that. When it comes to talking about the science for people, I think there is a natural tendency, just as humans, we get intimidated by what we don't understand. I'm not a climate scientist either. A lot of these climate reports can be intimidating to read because you're like, what is that word? But I think at the end of the day, it's really about just simplifying what we know, things that we learned in third grade science class, which is that when you emit toxins into the atmosphere, things change and things are altered, right? When you plant more trees, they capture CO2. Very fundamental things. And what I often try and tell people is whether you believe, with this report or that report, this projection, that projection, we can at least agree that polluting our air is not good. You can even disagree that it doesn't affect global temperatures, but let's just talk about how it affects your lungs and your children being able to play outside, right? And I often find that when you talk about the pollution angle, no one is interested in pollution. No one likes pollution. And so simplifying the science in a way where it is relevant and still being factual and still being truthful. I mean, we are the first organization to say that the science is very clear, that more carbon in the atmosphere is not a good thing and leads to temperature rise. But I think when you get too wonky with it, you turn people off, and you just got to relate it to what they care about. We don't want polluted water. Simple as that. We don't want polluted air. It's as simple as that. And it's not just for us, it's for future generations, which is really, I think, an important component when you talk to more conservative audiences as well. But if anyone wants to read the reports, I would just say that, look at it from all the different angles and consider all the different models that they're presenting there. There's a lot of reason for hope.
I like what you said about how it's important to remember that these people, they wanted to grab that attention, right? And the news certainly is, I mean, it's certainly not the first time I'm saying that the news wants to grab the most extreme examples, or try to take one outlier and say, well, is this the norm? They just kind of raise that question. And it's a business. So much of this is like an attention business, so to speak. And I'm just it's fascinating to see just how the lengths that people go to. And the thing is, you mentioned, I think the simplification, I think that's going to really help a lot, because once again, just knowing myself, I guess others, this is such a tough space to work in. And I guess I'll kind of I'll give you an example of kind of something that I've heard a lot, and kind of ask for your thoughts too. But one of the things I always I wonder is, when people say climate change, or different effects on climate, there doesn't seem to be a reckoning that it's hard to quantify how much of it is natural, how much of it is human caused. And this is just a broad example, right? But I would ask someone, say, okay, you're saying that climate change is happening. What percent of it, if you could just give me a ballpark number, what percent of it is human cause? What percent of it is natural cause? I haven't heard a single response from that. And it's not to say that I'm just saying that person is, I think that person is such and such, but it's almost like, that's an interesting question. Maybe we should find out. Maybe there's technology that can find out. And yet just so many people don't want to even ask these tough questions to themselves. They just want to get to like, well, it's either this or that. It's like, well, when has nature ever been like that? It's always fluctuates. There's certainly, elements on how things have changed since humans have come about. But I think one of the big questions I want to ask you about is really, how does technology kind of factor into this? You mentioned some of those projects. It seems like one of the areas of dishonesty, or of a lack of ethics generally in the conversation, is we don't factor in technology when we make these predictions, like, the world's going to heat up by 2 degrees, let's just say in 2050. Well, how will we know that if we have the current technology, or even just the technology we predict within next year? What are your thoughts kind of on why people forget these things and don't even try to ask the right questions generally when it comes to the environment?
Yeah, I think an issue that you see in general with our politics, regardless of the issue, is just an intellectual laziness at best, and at worst, intellectual dishonesty. And, I think there's so many reasons why people may engage in that. I go back to, again, being here in Texas. The conversation about climate and the role that humans play on that, and these discussions about reducing our dependency on oil and gas. A lot of people who are outside of Texas may look at us and think, "Gosh, y'all just must like pollution if you want to keep it going." But what I remind people is, these are jobs, these are livelihoods, right? I mean, I had really the honor of going to Midland last fall, and talking to people and touring oil facilities. These are good people, and these are people who they'll be the first to tell you that they care so much about the community that they're in, and they have a job that supports their family, and that's what it's about for them. Doesn't mean that there aren't ways that we should clean up our act or do that. But I think it's important just to realize, when you're talking with people, the perspective that they're coming from. And for a lot of people, this is a threatening conversation. When it comes to technology, what I'm really disturbed by in the mainstream environmental movement is this idea that we need to upend capitalism, we need to vilify business and industry in order to solve this issue. And what I would say is that whenever you are doing an analysis of a situation, you've got to look at the good and the bad. The bad is that, yes, industry and business have throughout, since the Industrial Revolution, whether knowingly or not, manipulated natural resources and have added to pollution around the world. But also, this is a system that has lifted millions out of poverty, that has given people an opportunity to live and thrive, that has created wealth and created the luxuries that we have as a country. And so I also think that capitalism can and will be the solution to climate change. You're already seeing a lot of industries and companies that, because of pressure from stakeholders, which is the great thing about capitalism, it is a democratic system. Stakeholders and customers who say, we want you to be more sustainable, we want you to reduce your impact on the earth, and they're doing it, and they're leading the way on that. Since I like to bring this up just because I think it's very telling of what can happen. When President Obama came into office, he put forward a climate plan in 2009. It was to reduce our emissions and to increase the amount of energy that we got from clean sources. That plan never passed, but in the last, this is by 2022, we beat the emissions reductions without government action, and we were on track in 2023 to beat the amount of energy that we bring in through renewables, all without government action. So it was because of industry. It was because of the private sector that realizes that people want this. And that they need to clean up their act. So I would just tell people, again, going in that vein of there's a lot to be hopeful about. There are so many case studies of technology and industry and the private sector that have been helping solve this issue. There's a place for government, but really the main drivers are going to be the actors within our capitalist system.
Indeed, that's a fascinating little story to tell people, especially knowing that it took that risk, right? Because so many people talk about the risks of the environment. What about the risks that businesses take when they do these sustainable kind of solutions, or when they just inadvertently kind of the invisible hand sort of element? And to take something from Adam Smith here, this unintended consequence that it has, a positive consequence, and I wonder if some of those activists kind of say those kind of things about Texas, maybe because they're afraid of Texas heat or something. It's almost like you almost can't distinguish the real intention, whether it's intellectual dishonesty or just laziness, or whether it's just almost like just a complaint about how hot it is. It's
well, but I also think there's something to the idea of getting out of your bubble, right? I mean, there's a lot of groups that are based in DC, and they don't really get out into the real world. I mean, the fact that as ACC we went to Midland and toured an oil facility, I can't tell you, certainly in recent memory, any time that an environmental organization has done that, because there is this mentality of it's us against them. But our approaches say it shouldn't be anyone against anyone. It should be certainly a battle of ideas, a competition of ideas. But if you're going to do anything to solve this issue, you've got to pull in everybody. Every community that this touches, it's important to know them, and it's important to work with them.
Absolutely. And let's go more into the just the negative aspects of this activism that we're seeing. I mean, we're especially in the UK, where my parents are actually traveling to right now as we speak. There's all this disruption. There's literally this annoyance that's coming out with people blocking roads and gluing themselves. I mean, Jesus, like how idiotic do these people have to be? It kind of goes back to the old kind of expression that people have when they see these kind of like, get a job. I mean, literally, like in this case, like you could probably get a job, with a company that believes in sustainability. It's like you could be doing more by getting a job and working hard and all that. And yet these people decide, you know what? The best idea I've got is gluing myself to the M25 around London. It's I just use an example, with the Just Stop Oil, all these groups. To say that there's one of the concerns I have is really just this virtue signaling that's happening, and the arrogance, and not to mention there's definitely some money behind this, because otherwise these people be dead broke, without getting a little stipend for what they're doing. But what are your thoughts on just generally how your concerns on the virtue signaling element? Not to say that certainly everyone it probably is just a minority, or certainly a big enough group, I think, to disrupt things. But what are your kind of thoughts on just how it's the movement, or just generally the environmental movement and the messaging has been clouded by these annoyances? I mean, you would think that one of the number one things you should do in politics is never annoy people and make people mad at your own cause. What do you think is kind of driving this too, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly, when you look at the history of movements, there is value in disruption. There is value in the Vietnam War protests that disrupted and in some cases, turned violent. There was. I'm not saying that these things are good necessarily, especially in terms of violence, but there have been value to movements in that. The civil rights movement, highly disruptive with bus boycotts and sit-ins. The difference, though, is we're now no longer targeting a system. We're targeting our fellow people. And what I mean by that is when there have been documented stories of this, when they shut down a highway and now someone who is on parole and has to get to their job to keep parole can't get there and then gets in legal trouble. That is not a compassionate way of building your point or building a movement. When you are ruining priceless pieces of art or cultural pieces, that is not helping the cause. And it is really an embarrassment that people would choose to be negative disruptors in this way instead of finding a way to be productive about it. I mean, our view of positive disruption is we're going to go in and plant trees in this community that doesn't have a ton of trees, and now people get to enjoy that. Or we're going to go clean up this park that kids play in so that kids can play in a clean environment. And, we don't get the press for that Just Stop Oil does whenever they throw something on a painting. But I'll tell you, the big difference is that, first of all, people in the communities that we work in, they know it, and they've joined us after they've seen us taking local action. And we're not keeping people from living the lives that they need to live. And so, I think that people do these things because they are genuinely concerned and scared about the state of the environment. But I think what I would tell them is we've got to funnel that into something positive, because more people are not joining the Just Stop Oil movement after they throw paint or oil onto a painting. People are joining ACC after they see us in their communities, cleaning them up and making them better places to live. So I think, in the short term, you get the media coverage, but I think in the long term, our approach wins out on that.
I agree. Yeah, I think people just, as these people say, they want change, they want action. I think what you're doing, Stephen, and what ACC is doing, you are enacting positive change. And when people see that, I think people really want to get on board. And I do think most people can see through this virtuing that's happening, and not to, I think on a larger scale too. This is kind of a broader question as well, just generally on how people can perceive the political leadership here. But it's also unfortunately happening on the higher levels too. When it's just hard, I think it's just going to be hard for people to get onto a movement when every year there's some sort of climate conference, and it's funny how they don't show any of this really. They just see you just see the formal event. But imagine all the luxurious private jets flying into Charles de Gaulle Airport or Orly Airport in Paris. Imagine all the luxurious hotels and the rooms that those leaders and the media and other people are staying in. This sheer elitism is really it's crazy how just brazen people are when it comes to these kind of things, and they tout this sort of climate element. It's like, honestly, they would get a lot more credibility if they got rid of these things. They just say, no, you're flying, on EasyJet, staying at a Motel 6, until you sort this out. Imagine how quick change would happen. Imagine how much faster. So what, just generally, like what are your thoughts on just how political leadership is tarnishing the messaging a bit, and the ways that you think leaders can perhaps act a little bit better to bring more people on into this movement here?
Well, I think the first thing is that we've got to elect serious leaders, and we haven't. We've elected people who want to, hold on to power and want to give us a little flash of progress in order to keep us satisfied. But really, this is a moment where I think you're completely right. We need to demand higher standards, and we need to make these people public servants again. And we need to make public service less susceptible to luxury, because it should not be a luxurious job. I think the work that y'all do about George Washington showed that he was a man who really did not revel in the luxury, and even his reluctant leadership. I think I would love to see more reluctant leadership from people, because those are the people you want in there. You are right that there's a great hypocrisy. A lot of it's sort of, I relate it to the corporate analogy as well. Of like, we have these climate conferences. They're sort of the equivalent of standing meetings where you feel like you've got to go and contribute something. And so sometimes you just, you create more work for the sake of showing that you're busy. These climate conferences, which we participate in some of them, full transparency there, but they're never thinking about how this affects people on a more local, granular level. And just this idea that we can have a global master plan for solving climate. I mean, there's a lot of collaborative work that countries need to do together. And especially, I think more advanced countries need to support more developing countries, because they are really facing the effects of this and don't have the tools to deal with it. So as much as there's value in global cooperation, we also, really at the end of the day, we need to get real about where these issues are coming from. China, India, Russia, the Middle East, these areas that in many ways have a political insulation, right? Because no one's going to stand up to China, but also have, in the case of China or India, an economic advantage where the world relies so much on them that if you tick them off, or if you place big kind of sanctions or whatnot on them, that has a reverberating effect. But that's the core of the issue. And every year they get together and they talk about what are ways that, the United States can lead more, and that these other countries could. The United States is leading the world in global emission reductions. We're leading the world in that. And we could be carbon neutral tomorrow and still have issues around the world because of these big polluters that are not being held accountable. And so, I'm not in a position to advise world leaders on what to do, but truly, if they wanted to actually do something and maybe even put an end to these climate conferences with this solution, hold the big polluters accountable, make sure that they clean up their act, And I think there's a lot of ways that you can make it economically an economic necessity that that places like China, India, Russia clean up their act. So I think that's the big thing to focus on is we have much bigger dragons to slay than they're leading on.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up because it just seems like generally also people, especially all these activists on the left, they don't understand that they assume, and this is kind of a common problem I think among Americans and maybe Western countries, is just assuming that every other country is just like us or wants to be like us. Like China, for example, right? As you mentioned, the coal plants opening up and all that, and not to mention if anyone who thinks that their standards are just like ours is just doesn't understand what's going on here. And it's like, oh, really? You really want China to follow along? Yeah, tell that to Xi Jinping, who's just trying to hold on power. By the way, by trying to crack down everything, he doesn't care at all about these environmental things as and only if it serves his purpose and his legitimacy. And you can say the same thing with Putin. You can say the same thing with a lot of other countries. It just seems like a bit of a denial on how on the fact that, by the way, there are other totalitarian countries that don't care about these things. It's kind of mind-boggling, right? Isn't it? Like how, going back to what you were saying, right? There is this lack of pursuit of this greater knowledge, and it's almost like going back to kind of really the problems in politics, which is people just wanting to hear what they want to hear.
Well, and I'll give you two examples in terms of how you make it economically necessary for them to clean up their act. Number one, I mean, when you look at critical minerals, right, things that go into your phone, your technology, your electric cars, things that even go into transmission infrastructure in this country. I mean, critical minerals are in everything. America doesn't really have a critical mineral mining operation. I mean, we've got a couple of things, but China and these African countries do, and when you look at the images of their mining operations, they are some of the most toxic, dirty operations that you can imagine. I mean, there are children in Africa who are being sent into these mines every day to mine, potentially toxic materials. The U.S. needs to lead on critical minerals, and we need to be not only for our own use, but an exporter of that. And we need to circumvent China's influence on that, but also energy exporting energy. During the Trump administration, America became a net exporter. We need to return to that again. A lot of people, it's interesting, especially the war between Russia and Ukraine has shown this vulnerability with Europe relying so much on Russian energy. If America was in a spot of being an energy exporter again, then we wouldn't have that global instability and people, having to rely on Russia or the Middle East for their energy. We could be leading on that as well. And so it obviously it's easier said than done. But there are definitely ways that the federal government that we can be promoting some of these areas of leadership more.
Absolutely. Yeah. We just, it's crazy to hear how children are being exposed to that. I mean, it's just, there's so many elements here where people can honestly tie in, things like human rights and all these things, going back to the interconnectedness. It's like, pick whatever issue people want to be excited about. And it's like, you can find that in the environmental movement, it feels like. And so I'm glad you bring those examples up. So let's kind of pivot a bit into some of those, more into some of the solutions now. And you kind of touched upon those areas, but what sort of legislation or policies or things that that ACC is considering, or just things that you and your group are considering to push forward in terms of not only a vision for where your organization wants to go, but also where you think policy and legislation is heading, and maybe just a few years down the line.
Well, I think even just this year, there's a lot of bipartisan things that are coming up. So on nuclear, we have the Advance Act, which is being worked on in the Senate right now. We are supporters of that and working on that. And I encourage people to contact their representatives in support of the Advance Act, because that is going to really modernize America's investment and regulatory framework around nuclear, which is really exciting, at least for me. This fall, we're going to see the Farm Bill come up. The Farm Bill is pretty important. I mean, a lot of people just think like it's literally just about farming, but there are so many conservation titles under that, and so they're negotiating that now. I don't have too many specifics, but the Farm Bill is one that we're going to be engaged on this fall to make sure that some good natural climate solutions and other things are added into that. And then looking toward the future, I mentioned permitting reform, which is still, should have been done by now, but I think we're getting closer on it. Permitting reform is vital to make sure that all of the money that was secured for clean energy and the Inflation Reduction Act actually gets spent. We have some issues with how the IRA got passed, but it is passed. The money's there for clean energy projects. Let's actually get them built instead of tying that money up and permitting and paperwork. And then moving forward, I think that the biggest thing that the federal government needs to promote is more local control, and by that I mean state, based initiatives around climate. I want California to experiment with climate policy, and it'll probably go poorly. But I want them to do that just as much as I want Texas to experiment with environmental policy, and I want Vermont to experiment. And I want all these states. I really want us to return to this experiment that America was set up to be, which is that the states get to be these labs of policy and figure out what works best. And so I think the more that the government can do to put things off of their roles and responsibilities and give it back to the states is going to be really important for the future of conservation and climate policy.
That's awesome. And just to, I think, reflect on what you said, and having these conversations, especially in Congress and the Farm Bill and whatnot, I think it gives people hope that there's still things that are working. I know that there's a lot of polarization and partisanship and just frustration with DC, but I don't think it's not just to even shy away from this, from how these environmental activists on the far left act. They think, the whole world's gonna end. I don't think the whole world's gonna end either in DC too, and so it's very promising to hear that you and your team are going to be involved in these negotiations and these talks. To move on to my final question before we get to our reflection question here, it's kind of a two-part question. The first is, how do we promote civility and just discussion about environmental issues? So that's number one. Number two is, despite all the challenges that we've spoke about and maybe some others that we didn't get to on this episode, what keeps you moving personally as someone involved in this movement, and really how you wake up in the morning every day and you think to yourself, today's another day, grateful for another day, and I'd like to get something done today.
Yeah, so I think on the first piece about promoting civility, we've done even more so an interesting job of just having community discussions. And last week we hosted a debate at our at our townhouse in DC with Braver Angels, and I think that as we become more connected as a country, as a world, we've become more connected in our bubbles, but less connected outside of those. And this falls under the category of easier said than done. But I really do think that people need to get out of those as much as they can and dialogue with people that they disagree with. I have had some of the most fascinating, eye-opening conversations with people on the left, on the right, who who disagree with our approach or disagree with me on certain issues. And you get to, I think, as long as you both engage in good faith, you get to a point at the end where you think, wow, we're actually in a lot more alignment than I thought. And it kind of gives you hope, right? And that hope kind of builds up as a snowball into a snowman, and helps kind of fuel future stuff. So I really think that the way you promote civility is you got to understand where people are coming from, and you've got to respect that. And it can't be personal, but also realize that everyone at our core, we all want the same thing. We have different ways of getting there, but we all want the same thing. We all want a clean world, even if you're talking with someone who is really into oil and gas and really, comes from a more traditional background there. They still want to be able to breathe easily. I say, like, we all want to avoid the Wall-E movie, which I think is a good unifier there. In terms of what motivates me, I really see this movement on the precipice of big, bold bipartisan action. I have seen more and more Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals come together on permitting, right? On maybe not as much on nuclear, but we're working on that, on natural climate solutions. And what's fascinating is that you will have, as a conservative, I come to permitting reform as get the government out of the way. As a liberal, they come to permitting reform as, what's keeping these clean energy projects that we want to get built from getting built. And so you're going to come at them from different angles, but you can agree on the end policy, which I think is really encouraging. And so I like doing that. I mean, I like being part of things that are difficult sells. And that's why I'm in politics, because a lot of political ideas, especially now with so much division, they are difficult to sell. But it's that chase and that experimentation of what works and how can you get people on your side that really excites me every day.
I love that passion, Steve. That's awesome. Hopefully more people have that same sort of drive that you have. And gosh, what a different world. Maybe might get more things done, with that kind of drive. Stephen, let's go to the final question, which is really reflecting on Washington's farewell address and just the pillars. I mean, and you mentioned the 6 pillars. I was like, oh, that's the same number as pillars I do. But it's on patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, and civility, which we briefly touched upon just at the previous question. Just generally, what sort of values, what sort of pillars out of all these do you think are most relevant and in terms of our understanding of the environmental movement and the topics that we covered today in our episode?
I hate to say all of them, but in many ways, patriotism is something of, I think that we've been gifted the most beautiful country, most naturally abundant country in the world. I mean, just the fact that you can go from across the country and see so many different types of environments and natural areas is really incredible. And we should be competitive as a country. I think America needs its patriotic, competitive spirit back in many ways, because we've started to lose that. Faith, there's a direct tie-in of people. I've talked with people who may not agree on some of the details of climate, but what they can agree on is that again, we were given this world, and our role is to be stewards of it and to leave it better off for future generations, because that's what our Creator made us to do, to really be people who tend to this earth. National unity, I think that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities for bipartisanship, and we need some bipartisan wins because so much has been politicized. Education is important in the sense that we try to educate our members, but we also try to foster sort of this continuing education spirit in them to always be learning about these issues and never assume that you know it all, because we certainly don't even know it all. Acting on climate is more fiscally responsible than not acting on climate in the long run. And then we talked about civility. I think this is an area that needs more civility along with just our politics in general. So I hate to give the answer of everything matters, but I do think that they all tie in nicely.
Excellent. Yes, absolutely. It's great to connect those, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. And just I think it goes to show just how broad the environmental movement that you and your team are going on. And I'm just so excited for you and for the ACC to find that next chapter and to lead the country on these issues. Well, Stephen, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on to Friends and Fellow Citizens. What you're sharing, I think, is not only informative, but also I think it gives people an opportunity to be optimistic and to know that it's not just the doomsayers and all that. There's still a lot that we can do. I think about how, even just, I live not too far from Lake Tahoe, people just picking trash after themselves. That'd be a fantastic little start, right? Imagine how many of those people, kind of say, oh, we need to save the climate, and they still leave trash on the beaches there. Or even just recycling or composting. There's so many opportunities to get involved. And I believe what you and your team at ACC are doing is that you're kind of bringing these issues also locally too, so that people also can feel like they're contributing to this cause. So how can people learn more about the ACC and the work that you all are doing?
Yeah, so our website is acc.eco, and you can get involved there, whether you just want to get emails or whether you want to get involved in a branch or attend one of our events. And then it's ACC_national across all social media. So encourage people to check that out.
Awesome. I'll be sure to link those down in the show notes below. And Stephen, it was a pleasure to speak with you. And I look forward to try to see what you and your team are up to. And I just know that you're going to help build, I think, a whole new generation of conservationists from different sides of the aisle. So kudos to you for pursuing on this journey. So thank you so much for coming on our program today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode with Stephen Perkins. Make sure to check down in the links in the show notes below to learn more about the ACC and its work. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.